So, sex. Well, that certainly got your attention, didn't it? I always think it's really interesting that sex is seen as such a taboo subject, and yet when anybody mentions sex, everybody is so engaged with the topic. Do you think that's because everybody really does want to talk about sex, and everybody really does want to know what's going on with everybody else? Okay, so put your hands up if you've ever been young. And by young, I mean age 13 to 18 years old. Bit of a trick question. I already know your answer. Now put your hands up if you've ever thought about sex. It's okay, don't panic, we've all done it. I've got 4 children of my own, so I've been there a few times, to say the least. Isn't it interesting, though, how you're a little bit more hesitant to put your hands up there? Okay, last one now. Put your hands up if you ever thought about sex when you were young. Might need a few moments to think about that one. Maybe not. Okay, so it looks like at one time, or many times in our youth, we thought about sex. So think about this for a second. When you were young, did you have questions about sex that you wanted to ask, but you were too embarrassed to ask them? Why was this? And how did this make you feel? Adolescence is tricky, wonderful, terrifying, and messy, and we all go through it, a little bit like sex. And yet there's an expectation to enjoy sex, and yet we're too embarrassed to talk about it. What impact do you think this has on young people? I've been studying sex and the sexual behaviours of children and young people for nearly 20 years now. It's always a massive conversation killer at parties. I often see my long-suffering husband cringe every time anyone asks me what I do for a living. When I asked him the approach I should take for this talk, he said, "Just rant at them, Soph, like you do at parties." But I won't rant at you today, I promise. Well, not yet anyway. So this story starts in 2006, when I was 26 years old and I was pregnant with the first of my 4 children. This makes me 41, by the way, save you doing the maths. At this time, I worked in youth services, and being pregnant, I made the association between pregnancy and young people and started to think about teenage parents. To cut a really long story short, I then went on to work with teenage parents for 6 years. In this time, I worked with hundreds of young parents, generally aged between 14 to 19 years old. These were some of the most inspirational people I have ever met. Their parenting skills put mine to shame. And yet they got such a raw deal from people. They were mercilessly judged by wider society. And this puzzled me. I spent years trying to fathom out why these amazing people I worked with were vilified by otherwise intelligent people. And then one day, the penny dropped. It was like an epiphany. It was all about sex. It wasn't about them at all, but it was about how wider society views sex and the hang-ups that we have about it, especially when thinking about young people. After all, there's no more of an advert that you've had sex, is there, than a big pregnant belly or a pushchair with your baby in it. From here, I then went on to work in sexual health. And as part of this role, I went into schools and taught children and young people about sex and relationships. The integrity of these young people never ceased to amaze me, with their well-thought-out questions and their mature approach to the topic. It was better than most adults that I knew. And this taught me that talking to young people about sex is valuable. But why the hang-ups? Why can't we speak freely and openly about sex in wider society? You can't perhaps see yourself at Sunday lunch with your in-laws talking about the great sex you had last night. like you can when you talk about the weather, for instance. But why is this? Sex can be a lot of fun. It is also vital to the survival of the species. We are all here today because people had sex. All the millions of people on the streets of the city all exist because somebody had sex. That's a hell of a lot of sex. And yet, we are embarrassed to talk about it. Why is this? Well, the reasons for this are historical. They are complex and they are intertwined. But I can give you a whistle-stop tour of a few of these. Sex, as we know, sometimes results in children. And in this day and age, contribution to the labour market is seen as paramount, with working and paying taxes seen as necessary. And child rearing is seen to disrupt this. Running alongside this are the moral and ethical aspects of sex, with sex and sexuality having set rights and wrongs, with any deviation from this being linked to shame. Lust is a mortal sin, but this throws up some conflicts because sex is used to sell, and yet we are too polite or repressed to talk about it. The demonisation of sex has been happening for years. Take masturbation, for example. Don't worry, I won't ask you to put your hands up for this one. So masturbation. Many people shudder at the thought of any public discussion on this topic. And yet the demonisation of this has been going on for a long time. Check out the physical consequences of masturbation from the 1700s. These were widely published and often associated with the young. Fits, epilepsy, impotence, and in women, hysteric fits, consumption and barrenness. It's a good job it isn't true. Otherwise, we'd have a really unhealthy population, wouldn't we? Philosophy then added to this with key influential philosophers of the past saying that we lose our ability to reason when we have sex. Although I would probably say that's part of the appeal. And that sex makes another person an object rather than a thinking human being, thus compromising their humanity. These are just a few examples, but these all converge to make sex something that has to be controlled and monitored in the society we live in today. Okay, so let's now come on to teenagers. Don't worry, we'll get back to sex in a minute. Think about these questions for a second. Where does childhood end? And where does adulthood begin? I've been studying this subject for years, and I still do not have the answers. A teenager is an idea linked to the society that we live in. Don't worry, they do exist. The noise levels in my house will confirm this. However, are they adults or are they children? The Convention on the Rights of the Child states that a child is anybody under the age of 18 years old. So coupled with this is the perception of innocence and the need for control and the need for the regulation. So where does this leave the adolescent? Adolescents are characters in flux. Teenagers are moving in the grey area between childhood and adulthood. It is a fluid state. But this brings up some conflicts, with teenagers thinking of themselves as adults and adults thinking of them as children. And this then becomes problematic when sexuality emerges. So what happens when these two things combine, teenagers and sex? Well, it is seen as unacceptable for a teenager to think about sex, let alone talk about sex, and God forbid, have sex. But why is it important to talk to young people about sex? We live in a highly sexualised society, and with sex there are many risks at all ages, such as STIs, unwanted pregnancies, and negative emotional experiences. But sex can also be a lot of fun and has a lot of benefits. So we have an obligation to educate our young people so that they can go on to have happy and healthy sex lives. Now, here's the thing. There is a wealth of evidence out there that suggests young people are more likely to delay sex when they are armed with robust and clear information. This information needs to be given without imposing feelings of shame on them, about their bodies, their feelings, their desires, because shame brings hiding. And when young people hide from information and support, they can put themselves at risk. And if we do this, then maybe, just maybe, they might not have all the hang-ups that we have about sex. So what can we do? We need to change our mindsets and the way that we think about young people and the way that we think about sex. Don't judge a young person when they make a mistake in relation to sex. Put your hands up if you ever made a mistake when you were young. If you haven't put your hands up, you're lying. We all make mistakes. I make lots, all the time, every day. So don't be quick to judge a young person and accept that they have an emerging sexuality, whether we like it or not. Now, I'm not saying we need to go onto the streets shouting at all the passers-by about sex, because you'd probably end up on the 10 o'clock news. But you can change your mindset and give clear information where you can. There is one caveat to this, though, that I want to mention. Not everybody is comfortable when talking about sex. And this is okay, because of some of the reasons I've already mentioned. You can still change your mindset. And don't be quick to condemn a young person and their emerging sexuality. Think back now to your teenage self. Can you imagine the impact it would have had on you if you could have asked all those questions you had about sex without feelings of shame and without feelings of embarrassment? Shame inhibits us, so let's not heap this onto the next generation. Sex and relationships education has only just become compulsory in the UK national curriculum. This shows us we have still got such a long way to go. I have a wonderful job now as an academic. I work at a great place, I work with amazing people, and I study a subject I love. But I still miss working with young people. I miss their rawness, I miss their resilience, and I miss their integrity. And as long as I have a platform, I will give them a voice. So stop talking about the weather and start talking about sex.